Yes.
Thank you, sir. So, having dealt with those few but important historical points, I now move to the present position, how things have changed and how things they are now. It's particularly important to do this for perhaps obvious reasons, so that everyone's aware of the current position before we go on to consider what recommendations you, sir, might wish to make and what suggestions and submissions we make about them. The NBA was established in 1993 when the regional transfusion centres all came under its control in 1994. From that point to today, the blood service in England has been a combined and centralised service. I leave to one side just for a moment the question of the relationship with Wales, which is somewhat complex in terms of the history and how responsibilities have been allocated as between them. But today, as NHSBT, it also has UK-wide control of transplant. Many witnesses have provided evidence on aspects of all this. Most notably for the blood services, live evidence was given by Professor Neuberger on the Advisory Committee of the Safety of Blood, Tissues and Organs, that's SABTO for short, Professor Mark Bellamy on the serious hazards of transfusion, that's SHOT for short, and the Haemovigilance Scheme, and Professor Derek Manas on transplant practice. Critically, someone who gave extensive evidence on the current position but wasn't called to give oral evidence, so some may be unaware of her evidence, is Dr. Gail Mifflin, Medical Director of NHSBT, and Dr. Mifflin is here in this room today. Given the importance of some of her evidence and its relevance to the present position, and therefore also to possible recommendations, as I've said, we think it's important to summarise some of it very briefly now. And obviously, if anyone wants to look more closely at these questions, they're all there in the written submissions. They're also all there in her witness statement. The topics which I would like to look at now there are four of them: decision-making and the risk-based decision-making framework, haemovigilance, horizon scanning, and recipient-directed focus. Now, first of all, decision-making and the risk-based decision-making framework. I begin with how decision-making within the blood service has changed to the way it is today. It's addressed in Dr. Mifflin's statement and in our suggestions for recommendations. We draw attention to the Alliance of Blood Operators, that's ABO for short, risk-based decision-making framework. The ABO is a network of over 90 blood operators from North America, Europe and Australia. It aims to be a high-performing international collaboration of blood operators which drives local performance improvement, knowledge exchange, and resolution of global strategic issues for the benefit of patients and health systems served by its members. The membership includes the American Red Cross, the Australian Red Cross, Lifeblood, the Canadian Blood Services, and NHSBT. A useful explanation of this framework for blood safety is given in a minute to the NHSBT board attached to Dr. Mifflin's statement. This document was produced by Dr. Williamson, from whom the inquiry heard, recommending the framework to the board. And this is at document WITN 0672100, and it's the next document I'm asking Lawrence kindly to put up on the screen. It's only 5 pages, and I'm going to be looking at only, actually only 4 of them, but only very briefly. This is a minute for a board meeting in 2015, November the 26th, 2015, prepared by Dr. Williamson, and and it's headed A Risk-Based Decision-Making Framework for Blood Safety. And I'm going to read out the first paragraph because it summarizes, as it says does what it says on the tin, summary. The ABO has developed a new framework for decision-making on blood safety issues, which was approved by the ABO Chief Exec in spring 2015. A web-based tool to enable use of the framework is now available. This contains all the elements within our current safety framework, being suitable for both implementation and removal of safety steps. It places more emphasis on stakeholder engagement and links better with overall risk assessment processes, and therefore offers improvements to the current framework. If approved, its first live use will be in the platelet bacterial screening pathogen inactivation project. Once we have experience with its use for blood safety decision, we will also wish to assess its suitability for decision on taking on organ safety, and JPAC will also consider this framework for suitability, as well as SABTO, which plans to review the current framework in 2016. If we then go down the page to background, please. 5.1, blood transfusions in the 1980s and 1990 resulted in many transmissions of HIV and hepatitis C. These had profound impacts not only on affected patients, but on a public and government confidence in blood services internationally. Public inquiries were held in several countries, and blood services reorganised to provide more central decision-making and stronger links to government. In the 1990s, early 2000s, much more sensitive tests became available for blood screening, along with techniques for inactivation of viruses and bacteria in plasma and platelets. These advances led to a belief that blood could one day become a zero-risk product, and led to adoption of safety steps with very low cost-effectiveness compared to other parts of healthcare. 5.3. In 2010, the Canadian Blood Services held an international consensus conference on risk-based decision-making, and that's the start date for the development of this framework. We go down to 5.6. Describing the framework, which, as you'll see at 5.5, is actually 80 pages long. The objective of such a framework is to provide blood services with a structured, rigorous process by which decisions affecting blood safety can be taken. This is considered to be important in achieving transparency, consistency between decisions, involvement of stakeholders, and evidence for regulators, government, and, if appropriate, suppliers. Although different jurisdictions may reach different decisions on the same issue, a consistent framework across countries will add weight to its validity. The framework is designed to operate in situations of incomplete evidence, and a small-scale assessment process is included for low-impact decisions. And then the proposal for its use by NHSBT is section 6. If we go over the page to 6.4, please, Lawrence, page 3. Risk management principles, that's the focus I want to try to achieve for now. The risk management principles, our corporate risk management processes do not currently define underlying principles. However, the suggested principles of beneficence, fairness, transparency, consultation, practicality, proportionality, vigilance, and continuous improvement underpin much of our activities already and are expressed in various strategies and assurance documents. 6.5, risk communication and stakeholder participation. We have a strong programme of stakeholder engagement and good processes for consultation on service reconfigurations. It's recommended that each project involving a safety decision produces at its outset a plan for stakeholder engagement. This is lacking in the current safety framework. Assessment principles. The proposed principles underpinning safety assessments are sensible. Assessments should be proportional to the risk, timely, based on a good quality of evidence as possible. Document any uncertainties, be transparent and appropriately confidential. Care should be taken to integrate assessments with other safety decisions with which there are cross impacts. Risk tolerability. This is defined in our risk management processes using the standard 5x5 matrix of probability versus impact. And then over the page at 4, points for consideration. It should be noted that the framework is not a black box which automatically generates a clear answer from a series of inputs. Blood safety decision-making will continue to require considerable internal and external discussion involving judgment in terms of proportionality, it's recognised that major recommendations, decisions on blood safety are taken by SABTO, health ministers, and I have presented this framework to members of the DH Blood Policy Team and the Health Protection Analytical Team. The SABTO framework is due for renewal in 2016. Now, I'm going to leave that document there, but I am going to come back to a couple of pages within the framework itself when we deal with recommendations, because it's important to see the extent to which what we in the inquiry, all of us, have been aware of as the precautionary principle, which can mean a number of different things to different people, but leave that aside for a moment, is itself enshrined within this risk management policy. So what that framework does is to make systematic the identification of relevant risks and the exclusion of irrelevant risks. Provides for an approach to engagement and identification of stakeholders, provides a toolkit of principles to be applied, including the precautionary principle, to which we'll come, as I say. It's not a black box from which decisions emanate, rather it is, as it says on the tin, an internationally recognised structure for decision-making. The full framework, if anyone wants to look at it, is on RLIT 0001989. The second topic is haemovigilance. Haemovigilance is, of course, a topic referred to in evidence. Recommendations are also made by many of the core participants on this in their submissions. The inquiry has documents on the history of haemovigilance in the UK, also from the documents from the Council of Europe and the SHOT steering group. We can map now how haemovigilance was also developing across Europe in the 1990s in response to the events focused on by this inquiry. Certainly, in our submission, a big positive step towards establishing SHOT was, as we say, the establishing of the NBA. Similarly, the mandatory haemovigilance scheme in France arose around the time that its new national agency was established. Certainly, sir, you'll be able to look at how the idea of haemovigilance developed in the early 1990s and became a number of the schemes that we can see around the world today. In these circumstances, whether a defined haemovigilance scheme was a realistic prospect prior to the early 1990s and should have been advanced by the blood services in the UK, as some have suggested, is, we would submit, doubtful. Considering SHOT itself, the first steering group was held on the 21st of December 1994. SHOT was launched in November 1996, with the first report being for the 1996-1997 year. Both Professor Bellamy and Dr. Mifflin commented on the SHOT scheme in their written statements, with Professor Bellamy also giving oral evidence to the inquiry about it. A key function of the SHOT scheme is to record the wide range of transfusion hazards which present, including newly identified TTIs. It might assist briefly to go to the most recent 2021 report, which is at SHOT 5032. And the first, again, there's the tin, and that's what it is. It's the annual SHOT report for 2021. If you go to the next page, please, Lawrence. Now this, I'm sorry, page, and I say the next page. It's the next page in my file, but of course it's page 9 of this document because I've only got the ones I'm referring to. My apologies. So this is a page that was referred to by Professor Bellamy. One of the questions that has been raised by core participants in their submissions was the extent to which there was cross-reporting between haemovigilance schemes, etc. And this is a helpful diagram showing the reporting relationship between SHOT and the MHRA. There is a combined reporting scheme. If we then go forward to page 15, please, Lawrence. Now, it's the first paragraph on this page that I wanted to draw attention to. This is key shot messages. Transfusion in the UK continues to be safe, and shot data for the last 10 years show the risk of death from transfusion as 0.92 per 100,000 components issued. This includes all deaths reported with imputabilities ranging from possible, probable, or confirmed. And what that shows, therefore, if my mathematics is correct, and I hope it is the risk of death in relation to all transfusion risks over the course of that 10-year period is 0.00092%. One then goes, Lawrence, please, to page 21. Thank you. Now, because these charts are in black and white, not colour, it's slightly less easy to navigate one's way around them, but I'm going to give it a go. These show the summary data for the top chart is for the last year. The lower chart is for the period since shot commenced, so it's a cumulative chart. And it shows a whole series of different things, near misses, etc., etc., etc. The particular thing that I wanted to draw attention to, for reassurance really, is the extent of TTIs, transfusion transmitted infections, which appears, it's the third last on the top chart, and it's naught. So in the last year, there have been no reported examples of TTIs. That's not just deaths, that's no reported examples of TTIs there. And the second chart, the equivalent is the third one down. This is reports since shot started, so in 1994, 95, 96. And we see the third one down, TTI, transfusion transmitted infections, and the figure, I haven't got my ruler out, but my guess is that that looks like around somewhere between 100 and 150 in the whole of that period. That is cumulative data for shot categories. Sorry, I think I gave the wrong date just a moment ago. 96 to 2021. So that's the 5-year period then. We would also note.
Sorry, what's the 5-year period?
I'm so sorry. I knew I shouldn't go off my track. It's not a 5-year period. It's a 20. 20. Yes, thank you. 26-year period, I think. 1996 to 2021, 25 years. Absolutely right.
And if we just go back to the previous page that you had up.
Yep.
I was puzzling to myself why the last 3 items on the list were ordered as they are. Why it is that TTIs are first, which might suggest they were regarded as a potentially greater risk. The answer might be, perhaps on the next page, if we go back, that compared with PTP, post-transfusion purpura, it's a greater.
They had been greater
incidence. So that potentially it's a bigger risk, but it's still, there were no incidents in the year leading up to the report in 2021.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. I shouldn't have said anything about my mathematics earlier on. But anyway, apologies for that. So what this report demonstrates is the combined approach to reporting between SHOT and SABRE, which is the Serious Adverse Blood Reactions and Events body. That's referred to on page 9. And we've looked at the data for 21 and cumulative. It's important we respectfully suggest, sir, that these data are borne in mind when you consider the extent to which recommendations may be necessary that might change the way this operates. But I'll come back to that in a moment. There's much evidence in Dr. Mifflin's statement. NHSBT has processes broader than shop reporting alone, and we draw your attention to the management process description for serious incident management, among other documents, at WITN 06720774. That paper also provides important information about NHSBT's approach to the duty of candour, which is a crucial aspect to any response to a serious incident. So now I turn to horizon scanning. Forward-looking scanning, identification of upcoming risks, is an important part of the Blood Service's roles. It's key in JPAC. You may have heard that acronym before. Just to be clear, what it's short for is Joint UK Blood Transfusion and Tissue Transplantation Services Professional Advisory Committee. So it's a useful acronym because it saves a lot of time. The key high policy documents provided in Dr. Mifflin's statement are the JPAC position statement, arrangements in place for monitoring threats to the UK blood supply from new emerging infectious agents, that's at WITN 06721141, and the JPAC management process description on preparedness for emerging infectious agents, that's at WITN 067270. The approach is a joined-up one, which takes information monthly from the NHSBT PHE, Public Health England, Epidemiology Unit Emerging Infectious Agents Report, and other sources from the EU Rapid Alert System. There is then an assessment of emerging risks undertaken by the Joint UK Blood Transfusion Service Professional, JPAC, and its Standing Advisory Committee on Transfusion Transmitted Infection, SACTI, that's SAC-TTI. Once a recommendation is agreed through JPAC, these issues are taken through to the individual blood services. In respect of horizon scanning, you may also be assisted by a further document attached to Dr. Mifflin's statement. In August 2021, the Government Internal Audit Agency produced a report on NHSBT on blood safety detecting emerging infections. That report makes a recommendation in respect of the current approach of the blood service concerning formal processes to review the effectiveness and efficiency of the horizon scanning process. However, the overall conclusion reached by the report was that there was a finding that substantial assurance that the framework of governance, risk management and control in respect of detecting emerging infections is adequate and effective. This document is provided relatively referenced WITN 06720771. Finally, the question of recipient focus. That is, focus by NHSBT on recipients as opposed simply to donors. We've already addressed above the point that recipient involvement is a key part of decision-making by the blood service. The ABO framework provides for such key stakeholder involvement in decision-making, which is something that was recently undertaken in NHSBT's work on the FAIR initiative for the assessment of individualised risk initiative concerning a more individualised approach to donor selection. And you may recall the FAIR initiative was touched upon a little by Ms. Maharaj in her closing statement on Friday. However, recipients also have an important place in some of the structural aspects of the blood service. Particularly pertinent is the NHSBT Therapeutic Product Safety Group, one of a large number of groups which reports to NHSBT Care Committee, upon which I'll comment in a moment. The role of the NHSBT Therapeutic Product Safety Group is important because of its key position on patient safety, and it's useful to consider the first page of the terms of reference in full, and that's at WITN 06721002. And here we have, thank you, Lawrence, the terms of reference for NHSBT Therapeutic Product Safety Group, aims of the TPSG to ensure that NHSBT is coherently engaged in the developing safety agenda within and beyond NHSBT, including shaping the safety agendas of external bodies, e.g. SABTO and JPAC, responding to emerging threats to safety, providing advice to care and external stakeholders on safety matters, communicating safety matters to stakeholders and the public, proactively seeking and considering safety measures relevant to NHSBT. And the remit of TPSG, the remit of the group is limited to products manufactured by NHSBT, blood components, stem cells and tissues. It includes the safety of the donor only where this could impact upon patient safety. Donor safety is a specific responsibility of the care groups and the clinical governance arrangements in blood, tissue and stem cell donation. So the point about that is that this group is specifically focused on patient safety and is not concerned with donor safety, except to the extent that donor safety itself is something that impacts upon patient safety. And the group reports to CARE. As we see from the bottom of the page, accountability. The group is accountable to NHSBT Care Committee. The group will meet 2 monthly in advance of the NHSBT Care Committee. And if you go over the page, you see the membership, medical and research director, that's Dr. Mifflin. These terms of reference are important, and we say speak for themselves, but they do, however, prompt a point worth repeating. Products manufactured by NHSBT here is directed to blood components, stem cells and tissues. As has been repeated many times during this inquiry, so the role of the blood service has been distinct in respect of blood products on the one hand and blood components on the other. Indeed, with the advent of recombinant products, this distinction is more acute, as many products are no longer derived from blood. This is not expressed to excuse, but merely to flag once again how this distinction can be relevant to recommendations. For example, the fact that, broadly speaking, NHSBT is self-sufficient in components. The TPSG reports to NHSBT Clinical Audit Risk and Effectiveness Committee, that's CARE, we've dealt with that. And NHSBT recognise the setting out of the terms of reference is not determinative of the conduct of an institution. Some of that current conduct is addressed through Dr. Mifflin's statement in those sections addressing the current position. However, we do say that these committees play an important role in ensuring the safety of recipients and ensuring that recipients are in the core of any decision-making on clinical audit, risk and effectiveness. So now, I turn to the question of your recommendations and what suggestions we make for those recommendations and any comments we have on the recommendations suggested by others. Having considered some of the current work of NHSBT and the bodies associated with it, we now turn to recommendations. But we begin by thanking all the core participants for their recommendations insofar as they concern the blood service. These have been read and considered by Dr. Mifflin and others within the service. This process provides a valuable opportunity for the blood service to continue to improve and meet its core aims. As I say, I'm going to start by the recommendations suggested by NHSBT itself. That was, of course, as part of the process. We started this in May or June last year, when we put in interim submissions on this, and those interim submissions were then swept up into our written submissions that we provided back in December. Now, some of these recommendations, which I'm going to read out, I'm not going to add very much more to, but I think it's important publicly to state what it is that we suggest the recommendations might be. The first relates to risk-based decision-making. We've been talking about that just now in the context of the ABO framework. The suggested recommendation is this, that the approach to blood safety policy making in the UK by those concerned with blood policy is based on risk-based decision-making in accordance with international best practice. That the appropriate international practice is the risk-based decision-making framework developed by the ABO, that the levels of appropriate risk tolerability and cost-effectiveness parameters are defined for transfusion safety policy making by an expert body independent from the UK governments and the UK blood services. That body should advise the UK governments, which will make the ultimate decision on risk tolerability. This suggestion broadly reflects current practice in the involvement of SABTO as an independent advisory body which applies the ABO framework referred to earlier and gives advice to ministers who then make final decisions. As we've already stated, the ABO framework is an internationally recognised framework used across the globe. This framework includes many principles which are relevant to decisions. One such principle, which has been an important part of the evidence in the inquiry, is the precautionary principle and the proper approach to unknown or poorly defined risks. The ABO framework deals with this at two important sections. And could we go, Lawrence, please, to RLIT 0001989. Now, I've already said that this document, there's the front page, is 80 pages long, and I am only going to be referring to 2 of those pages. But of course, anyone who wants to examine this framework in more detail can do so by reference to that, to the reference I've just given. So if we could possibly go first to page 44. Please, Lawrence, thank you. The guiding principles, and I don't want to read through all of these, but the principles are, I should say, this section, just to be absolutely clear, is headed Chapter 7, Health, Economics and Outcomes Assessment. And the guiding principles are in accordance with that heading. So number 1, health economic analysis is not static. Number 2, the societal perspective, over the page to 45. Number 3, context. Number 4, transparency and best practice. Number 5, estimation. And number 6, precaution. And this is what's said at this stage about precaution. While precaution remains a strong force in blood safety, health economic analyses support concepts of proportionality and consideration of the impact of actions to reduce risk and increase overall safety because of the presence of a wide diversity of risks. And if we then go over to page 49, please. I'm sorry, perhaps we should go to 48 first, thank you. So as part of step number 3, conduct the analysis. Remember, this is a systematic, slightly mechanistic approach to ensure consistency across decision makers. This is conducting the analysis. So this is the heart of the process. And over the page, under considerations, models are simplified representations of a broad range of possible outcomes. The best model for a given question should be only as complex as is necessary to answer the question it was designed to address. Overly complex models are difficult to work with and even more difficult to find appropriate data for entering into the model. So that is advice about the way to undertake this analysis. But the important bit is by the magnifying glass or whatever it is immediately below that in italics. The use of these techniques can lead to insights that may support precaution. In situations where uncertainty is very high, it may be appropriate to adopt an intervention that favours precaution rather than a proportional intervention. Now, that is the precautionary principle in practice. Where you are uncertain about some aspect of a proposed decision or step that you might take or something of that sort, and that uncertainty carries with it risks which you don't know the extent of, then you should apply a precautionary approach to it as opposed to what's referred to here as simply a proportional intervention. That is the precautionary principle in practice, and that's embedded within this framework. The position remains, as stated before, that the framework is not a black box into which information is put and an answer provided. Decisions in respect of risk tolerability, cost effectiveness, and the whole range of other relevant considerations are all taken into account. Thus, on the setting of risk tolerability and what represents the lowest practical level of risk, NHSBT's submission is that an expert body with remit to advise ministers is appropriate. That role is currently fulfilled by SABTO, and thus NHSBT suggests any recommendations maintain that body as the appropriate body to advise ministers and blood services as appropriate on these issues. The evidence of Professor Neuberger is, he was Neuberger, in fact. Thank you. It is particularly important in understanding how SABTO is properly placed to undertake that role, and his evidence is commended to the inquiry. The framework is an important document. We are aware that the inquiry may feel it does not have all the information it requires on it. For one reason or another, we're not entirely sure about. We're not certain that the full framework document got onto the inquiry system in the way that we thought it had when we submitted Miss Mifflin's, Dr. Mifflin's statement. There was a link that went with it, and the link may not have worked. We don't know. But the point I'm making now is quite simply that NHSBT would be happy to respond to further Rule 9 requests if that seems appropriate in relation to this framework. We also submit that for major recommendations, SABTO, which applies the framework and then provides recommendations to ministers, may be helpful as well. The second recommendation is it concerns future look back. An independent expert body advised the UK governments on whether a look back exercise should be undertaken across the UK in respect of a transfusion transmitted infection. That an independent expert body advised on the appropriate approach to such a look back exercise. Such advice would be specifically helpful in the context of large national look back, as opposed to a small specific patient-related look back. In such cases, the principles to govern the approach to look back, including issues such as when donors no longer attend blood services, look back beyond the donations where samples are kept, identifying the roles and responsibilities of parties involved would be helpful. As a starting point, the current policies on look back are provided for in Dr. Mifflin's statement at WITN 0672126 and WITN 0672132. As Professor Neuberger also explained, the issue of look back is something which has been before SABTO and is currently being considered by a working party led by Dr. Sue Brailsford, who's also in the room today. As with our last recommendation concerning the ABO framework, NHSBT is of the view that SABTO is the appropriate expert body with experience of this field to be able to make meaningfully forward-looking recommendations on future look-back. It is important to recognise, particularly in respect of new or emerging diseases, that look-back may well take a different form dependent on the specific characteristics of the disease. That's important in recognising the role of the expert body to advise prospectively, considering the importance of the context of any new disease. The third suggestion for recommendation is consent to transfusion, and the recommendation that we suggest is that patients receiving blood transfusions are properly consented in compliance with NICE, SABTO and professional regulator guidelines. As a starting point, NICE, SABTO and professional regulators each represent a different but important source of guidelines on ensuring proper consenting as part of the transfusion process. Professor Murphy noted in his written evidence that there's no shortage of guidance on this issue. The problem is with its implementation. There is still much work to be done to achieve proper implementation of guidelines. The 2021 National Comparative Audit of NICE Quality Standard QS 138 demonstrated that only 64% of transfused patients had evidence of receiving written or verbal information about risks, benefits, and alternatives to transfusion. Professor Murphy pointed to two tools which might drive further improvements in implementation. First, the Commissioning for Quality and Innovation, that's CEQIN, payment framework, which provides a financial incentive to hospitals to secure a certain standard of care. And second, an electronic alert system which provides a prompt when a prescription of blood is made to secure compliance. That's WITN 700-1001. NHSBT is of the view that Professor Murphy's evidence is overall key in this area and commends it to the inquiry. It's been recommended that NHSBT be given a role in ensuring consent for blood transfusion. By that I mean it's been suggested as part of the suggested recommendations. This may be freestanding or part of its obligation pursuant to NHSBT directions issued by the Secretary of State to promote the appropriate use of blood. In NHSBT's submission, the appropriate use of blood is an important part of NHSBT's role and transfusion expertise. It's centred on giving blood only when necessary and only to the extent necessary. On the other hand, the issue of consenting is a broader matter based on regulatory guidelines, including GMC, good medical practice. NHSBT's submission is that clinicians must ensure they undertake consenting in line with their regulatory and ethical obligations and as imposed by their own professional bodies, including those mechanisms identified by Professor Murphy to progress consenting. It's those bodies which have the appropriate management, regulatory and ethical control properly to achieve positive change for patients. NHSBT has limited mechanisms through which to implement the kind of recommendations Professor Murphy suggests. Thus, placing this in the remit of NHSBT would not be an effective way to secure an improvement in proper consenting. So the recommendations are good. Professor Murphy's suggestions are good suggestions, but there's a limited amount that NHSBT itself can do about them, or some of them. The SHOT scheme, serious hazards of transfusion. The suggested recommendation is that all NHS organisations have a mechanism in place for implementing recommendations of the SHOT reports and for monitoring such implementation. The position about implementing recommendations as such is a complex one. Professor Bellamy gave evidence that reporting to SHOT is professionally mandated. Thus, among other mechanisms, the regulatory framework operating around clinicians, i.e. good practice enforced by the GMC, acts to require such reporting. We submit that implementation of SHOT report recommendations should similarly be professionally mandated and monitored by healthcare regulators. This will produce a requirement for implementation within a system that has an inbuilt monitoring framework. This must not absolve healthcare providers of a separate obligation to monitor the implementation of the recommendations. Professor Bellamy gave evidence that tasking SHOT with making mandatory recommendations changes the dynamic of the organisation itself, and it may impair its ability to come up with the right recommendations. So I think there's a trade-off to be had, he said. Making recommendations professionally mandated strikes the right balance, and it is in line with other guidance which is produced to improve NHS services. This also permits appropriate flexibility in that a healthcare provider can choose to depart from a recommendation with good reasons and an appropriate risk assessment. The next 5 recommendations, that's 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. I'm being really careful to get my maths right now. Are all based on a particular document, which I'd like to turn to now. This is a document called Transfusion 2024. It was exhibited to Professor Murphy's witness statement. It's an important paper of which Dr. Mifflin is one of the authors, and it's at WITN 001031. Thank you, Lawrence. And this, you'll be glad to hear, is the last document to which I am going to be asking Lawrence to take you. So, just again, looking at it from the top, this is a 5-year plan for clinical and laboratory transfusion in England. You'll see that Dr. Mifflin, Gail Mifflin, is one of the authors. It's essentially an NHSBT supported document. It isn't. It doesn't have the force of it isn't practically implemented in full, but it is the plan that NHSBT wishes to see implemented. And this document is a summary of the full Transfusion 2024 document. As you see, it's an article about that document. Sorry, I didn't make that clear. The abstract says this: the Transfusion 2024 plan outlines key priorities for clinical and laboratory transfusion practice for safe patient care across the NHS for the next 5 years. It's based on the outcomes of a multi-professional symposium held in March 2019, organised by the NBTC and the NHS Blood and Transplant, attended and supported by Professor Keith Willett, Dame Sue Hill, on behalf of NHS England and Improvement. The best practice guidance contained within this publication will facilitate the necessary change in pathway design to meet the transfusion challenges and pressures for the restoration of a cohesive and functional healthcare system across the NHS following the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's the context. And what I want to take you to is the table that appears on page 2 and following. That's table 1, which covers the next 3 pages. I'm actually only going to take you to it over the first of the 2 of those pages. And in short, this table sets out the Blood Service's own freestanding recommendations, which it adopts for the purposes of suggesting to Sir Brian what his recommendations might be. And as you see, Table 1, Summary of Transfusion 2024 Recommendations. Section A, Patient Blood Management, and there are 3 items under that. Under 2, Resources to Support Clinical Transfusion Practice, strengthen support within hospitals and NHSBT for clinical transfusion practice, develop and implement a national competence framework for transfusion practitioners. There's then a column that deals with how deliverable this is, and then, importantly, we would submit there is a column for key responsibility, other stakeholders, and who might be responsible for delivery, therefore. And these recommendations here are also developed in Dr. Mifflin's witness statement. I'm sorry, these are the basis for the written submissions that we make about recommendations. So then 3, inclusion of transfusion in national patient quality and safety initiatives, aim to include, where feasible, transfusion data in national databases of diseases, outcomes for which transfusion is regularly used. Then there's a section under transfusion laboratory safety, a section under laboratory staffing over the page, and then at the bottom of the page, section under information technology, transfusion IT, vein-to-vein electronic tracking, and recommendations for further research and development. Having looked at that, I'll briefly, therefore, refer to those recommendations as they appear in our written submissions, that I just referred to. Staffing levels, this is recommendation 5, relating to staffing levels in clinical haematology and laboratory areas within NHS trusts, the suggested recommendation is that transfusion laboratories are staffed and resourced adequately to meet the requirements of their functions. Just to make it clear, where they're talking about hospital transfusion laboratories. Recommendation 6, education of healthcare professionals in the field of transfusion medicine, that people working in the NHS are adequately trained in transfusion and that accountability for this is defined. Recommendation 7, transfusion and governance. NHS trusts have appropriate structures and governance for delivering safe transfusion practice. These are originally defined in Health Service Circular 2002, number 9, Better Blood Transfusion, but are now part of the work of NHS England, National Blood Transfusion Committee, with further guidance contained in the document Transfusion 2024. It's obviously the document to which I've been referring. Information technology is adopted where it has been shown to improve patient safety in relation to transfusion, including that relevant NHS bodies implement electronic systems for identification, blood sample collection and labelling. In relation to that, we would note that this derives from Transfusion 2024 and is in accordance with the NHS long-term plan. We ought to add one comment, though, on the question of vein-to-vein tracking. Transfusion 2024 includes development of a system of vein-to-vein tracking. The plan notes that implementation of these significant schemes would be subject to finding a funding solution. However, it seems a reasonable recommendation that robust systems to understand the outcomes of people undergoing transfusion of blood components, together with one that allow clinical audit and research, should be an aim of the NHS. This is likely to be best achieved using IT systems that have appropriate interfaces between existing systems. Simply trying to take data out of many existing systems into a new registry would be fraught with data transfer risks and potential errors, and would be extremely difficult to set up and costly to maintain. Furthermore, if this were done correctly, it should allow NHSBT to manage the blood stocks throughout the system and for experts to audit the appropriate use of blood components using simple analysis tools rather than complex, timely audits. Then 9, the recommendation, this is monitoring outcomes for recipients of blood and blood components, that a framework be established for recording outcomes for recipients of blood components, that these records be used by NHS bodies to improve transfusion practice, including by providing such information to haemovigilance bodies. Having dealt with these recommendations arising out of Transfusion 2024, we make a brief comment on the question of accountability and responsibility. For a framework of those things which functions successfully, it's key that the body invested with accountability and responsibility have the necessary powers and expertise properly to ensure implementation of rules and policy. Clearly, in some situations, this will be NHSBT. Indeed, of particular note is the ongoing role for NHSBT in collaborating with the National Blood Transfusion Committee to develop guidance and influence best practice, and the role of NHSBT supporting clinical transfusion and patient blood management initiatives across the NHS. Transfusion 2024 provides important guidance on the key responsibilities for the recommendations and stakeholders necessarily involved in taking actions forward. In considering your recommendations, sir, we would suggest that this document provides guiding context when you consider accountability and responsibility. However, we would also flag the importance of any such recommendations being informed by the expertise and powers of bodies currently, and whether as part of the recommendation any extension of powers should similarly be recommended. Finally, the question of allocation of livers for transplantation. The suggested recommendation is this: that the principles and protocols currently applicable to the allocation of livers for transplantation in respect of patients with a history including infection with a TTI through blood, blood components or blood products are appropriate and be maintained. Our final recommendation was to suggest the affirmation of the principles and protocols currently applicable to the allocation of livers for transplantation. The inquiry heard evidence on this from Professor Manus in respect of those recipients infected as a result of infected blood, and focusing on liver transplantation, he explained the following in his oral evidence, and this was at INQY 1000259. What I suggested in my report was, if we were going to look at a way of trying to give some advantage, then the system has the variant syndrome list, or they could say, well, every centre could use the DCDs that they have and that are allocated to them and in their list that they give to us. They could itemise which patients have been co-infected and why they're on the list and why they're getting priority. But I think the NLOS system it's much safer because it monitors them all the time, and they will, every time there's an offer, they'll be in the system. And when they decompensate, they get it. They're not disadvantaged at all. The system makes sure of that. In NHSBT's submission, the current approach to transplantation decisions for this class is the appropriate one. It's been made based on expert clinical knowledge. It's a much safer route, which ensures a transplant is given at the appropriate time. Insofar as any recommendation is going to be made on this issue, it should be one that to endorse the current approach, we would respectfully suggest. It's been suggested that the current framework omits to consider the curative element of liver transplantation, and that this matter should be recognised as a positive in favour of the transplantation. NHSBT's position is that this argument is difficult. While it may possibly be curative, there are significant risks associated with transplantation, including the ongoing need to suppress the immune system. We maintain the appropriate approach is that advanced by Professor Manus. Insofar as you, sir, are of the view that the current framework does not properly consider the matter of the curative effect of liver transplantation, we would suggest obtaining further evidence of competing benefits and risks of such an approach from Professor Manus or another appropriate specialist. Finally, on this, recommendations of others, I'm not going to deal with all the recommendations that have been suggested that have relevance to the blood services, but I'm going to deal with a few of them. We've responded to a number of the recommendations already advanced by core participants. We hope that our views on our recommendations, including those in the written submissions, are of assistance. In addition, we hope that the current practice section of our written and oral submissions, along with the evidence, particularly of Dr. Mifflin, is of some assistance in setting out how many of the recommendations are already met by the blood service. We do, however, comment on this small number of recommendations now. We hope this doesn't in any way appear to detract from the recommendations we don't comment on. It's not our intention, and instead we hope reflects the position we've already addressed. First of all, quality of record keeping. NHSBT agrees that inadequate record keeping has hampered look-back exercises and hampered the ability of the infected to understand the pathogens to which they have been exposed and to seek justice and recompense. It has been a regulatory and legal requirement since 2005 to have full traceability, which clearly is important and beneficial. However, many trusts still use the manual record, which are labour-intensive. NHSBT is of the view that the best way to resolving this matter is to achieve the introduction of vein-to-vein software in trusts, as was already commented on in respect to Recommendation 8. This would allow an integrated approach which would provide more benefit to patient safety, understanding and traceability than, for example, a separate registry of transfusions. In respect of the proposed recommendation that blood, tissue and organs should never again be collected in prisons, borstalls and other such correctional institutions, NHSBT agrees and is of the view it would not do so. A number of core participants have commented on the current position concerning self-sufficiency in England and Wales. In respect of blood components, which is the core of NHSBT's role, we are self-sufficient. Finally, as we noted at the beginning, we've heard loud and clear what Rowana Maharaj said in her submissions on behalf of the Thalassemia Society on Friday, which seemed to us to have a pertinence that went more widely than simply those whose interests she was formally representing. What she said, and I'm going to read it all out if I may. Oh, sorry, this part of it. I think that a recommendation should be given to NHS blood and transplant. I think more people, and donors, for example, I feel sometimes they don't understand the risks that they bring to the recipient. It's great to donate blood. I'm alive because of the blood I have received throughout my life. But I think when people donate blood, they don't understand really that while you're giving this great gift, we can't deal with any more health conditions because it's really difficult to deal with the one that we were born with. So I think there needs to be more emphasis on the communication to the general public, to donors, about how important it is to protect the recipients and to take that responsibility in filling out and answering correctly, honestly, on the questionnaires, disclosing information. I do think there needs to be more emphasis on that, and I don't think that the communication that I've been seeing is sufficient. And it's a worry to me every time I have a transfusion. Am I going to be protected? Now, those of us sitting in the room when she said that, it rang loud and clear as a concern, which was emblematic of the concern of many infected and affected at this inquiry, even though they weren't thalassemia sufferers or requiring regular or frequent transfusions of the sort that she was describing. We've heard this. We understand the point. The issue of messaging to donors on the safety of blood and its impact on recipients is an important one. NHSBT will continue to consider how best to improve our messaging and communication with donors. Before I come very briefly to my concluding remarks, there's one matter I want to raise on behalf of the Welsh Blood Service. For this purpose, I'm speaking on their behalf and not just that of NHSBT. And I'm asked to say the following on their behalf. As traversed in the evidence received by the inquiry, there's historically been no neat separation between the blood services in England and Wales for the periods the inquiry has been considering. For much of it, the Welsh service was in effect operating as a region of the English service. The Welsh Blood Service has put in brief written submissions which endorse the submissions and recommendations advanced by NHSBT and has therefore taken the decision not to add to those submissions in closing on the basis that it endorses the position taken by NHSBT. The Welsh Blood Service has also confirmed that in collaboration with the other UK blood services through the Blood Services UK Forum, which is the vehicle for coordination and promotion of consistency and collaboration between UK services, it looks forward to reviewing and working on any recommendations made by the inquiry. And I know, sir, that the motivation for asking us to say that was to ensure that no inadvertent offence was given by the fact that they weren't making oral submissions themselves. Some concluding remarks on behalf of NHSBT then. We have set out in written submissions the impression that we have of the conclusions that should be drawn from the evidence the inquiry has heard, whether on events or on other more individual aspects of that evidence. Some of that has been expanded upon today. There are a small number of overarching conclusions that we do wish now finally to emphasise. We do so simply because they might otherwise remain unstated in the submissions heard by the inquiry, stated in this room. We stress that nothing we say here is intended to detract from what we've said already as to the terrible suffering caused by the events that have prompted this inquiry, nor is it intended to excuse any conduct of anyone which caused or contributed to such suffering. The first is that the evidence made available throughout the inquiry makes it plain that NHSBT's predecessors were significantly hampered in their response to the infected blood tragedy because of the funding and the structure of the blood service. Both of these factors are fundamental context to the actions of the service, i.e. what it did and what it did not do. They weighed heavily as limitations upon the response that could be mustered to avoid and mitigate infections. While the resolution of problems with structure and funding would not have been the complete answer, to the questions of the blood services posed by this inquiry, NHSBT maintains they were significant frustrating factors, amounting to a common theme that appears throughout the story of blood in England and Wales. As such, NHSBT wishes to recognise the service of the clinicians, scientists and other staff concerned, past and present, and undertaken in difficult circumstances and without the tools we take for granted today, with their duty to recipients and donors in their minds. It also wishes to pay tribute to those of its own staff, past and present, many of them very elderly, who responded to Rule 9 requests and in many cases gave evidence orally to the inquiry. Secondly, the evidence also makes it plain that the position of NHSBT's predecessors, essentially occupying a place behind treating clinicians, was one into which it had little or no input, let alone control over treatment decisions. Specifically, the requirement for the service was to provide a safe and sufficient supply of blood to meet clinical needs. By definition, it had very little control over how that supply of blood was used. That was an inevitable corollary to the overall position of the blood service in the structure and of its focus upon providing a reliable supply of blood. Thirdly, lessons learned. NHSBT hopes that the information it has provided to the inquiry demonstrates the learning that has already been taken from these terrible events. The service in England and Wales has been transformed from a loose federation of RTCs to a special health authority which ensures high standards across its practice. Its response to VCJD and the creation of SHOT were responses informed by the experiences of the past and ones which show the evolution of the service to its modern state. Today, all the services in the UK operate an internationally recognised risk-based decision-making framework, which I've described, which appropriately and transparently manages risk with the benefit of expert clinical advice. NHSBT looks forward to the report of the inquiry and will study it carefully to take forward learning and recommendations further to improve the service that it provides. Fourthly, NHSBT wishes to recognise the work of donors who over the years have given tens of millions of donations and made a blood service possible. Without their trust and goodwill, it would not have been and would not now be possible to provide a supply of blood to meet clinical needs. Fifthly, we express the hope on behalf of NHSBT that it has been able to deliver on its promise to assist in the inquiry's endeavour in every way that it can, and that it is obvious to the inquiry and to all others concerned that that approach was shared by the witnesses who have given evidence on behalf of NHSBT. It seems so to us, we hope it was to everyone else. Finally, we return to where we began, to the infected and affected, many of whom have suffered for decades without acknowledgement or recognition of what happened to them. It's impossible to imagine the hurt and suffering caused and compounded by these events and the failures to respond to them. NHSBT repeats that it wishes to acknowledge each individual tragedy, and we hope that the inquiry and the reports soon to be issued will bring answers that have not been provided in all the decades that have gone before. And perhaps most importantly of all, and unequivocally and without caveat, we also recognise the part the blood services have played in that harm and suffering. So we would like to say again to all those infected and affected, for all they have had to endure, we are deeply and truly sorry. Thank you, Sir Brown.
Now, just for a question, if I may. The predecessor of NHSBT, the National Blood Authority, was a party to the A&NBA case, which Mr. Justice Burton decided. He made various findings of fact. One of the findings he did not have to make was by way of concession from NBA, as I understand it, that screening for HCV should at the latest have been introduced by the 1st of April 1991. your submissions on paper take a different and later date. Why?
The simple answer, and I hope this doesn't seem mean-spirited in some way, or to go against what I've been saying all morning, but the simple answer is that we, looking at the evidence now, we don't accept that there was fault in going back right the way to that date. We take a later date. The fact that that concession was made, I think in evidence, doesn't necessarily mean that that is the correct answer. And what we would say to you, sir, is that when you're examining this issue, it wouldn't be right for you simply to say, well, that concession was made, then that's an end to the matter. What you would need to do, we respectfully submit, is to look at all that evidence and come to your own conclusion about it. And you've heard many, many submissions about that, which are based on a range of factors, a range of bits of evidence. All we're saying is we would respectfully ask that you come to your own conclusion about it, rather than simply adopting it because it was adopted by Mr. Justice Burton in that case.
So, if I haven't misread the judgment, it was a concession made by counsel, then instructed. But be that as it may, you're not telling me there's anything specific that you had in mind. They are just the general considerations that you've made reference to.
That, sir, and the factor relevant to that case, which is that in order, what was relevant in terms of strict liability in that case was the nature of the cause of action for product liability, which did not itself depend upon fault. So it's a, I mean, again, this is the last thing I want to, it's the last thing I want to say last, if you see what I mean. But there are complexities from a strict liability point of view, and in terms of the fault, which I think is what you're putting to me.
Well, I'm simply putting to you the date at which he said it should have been introduced. Now, that's the judgment was saying was an agreement, or rather a concession formally made during the course of the hearing. No doubt, looking at the evidence before him, and of course the evidence was different from the evidence which there has been here, as to the pros and cons of the situation in that context. So in a context in which, as you point out, fault was to be assumed on certain basis, the date was as it was.
May I speak to the
yes,
organ grinders for a moment?
Of course.
The answer to your question, sir, is sorry, noise is off. The answer to your question is there's nothing else now that I wish to draw to your attention in this hearing room as a factor which would explain why that's all wrong and we're taking this position. We have set out our case on this in detail in the written submissions, and there's a range of factors referred to in there, and I would commend them to you, and that's all I can say.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your submissions. Now, I think we have to hear from Ms. Richards in a moment as to what is in store for us, not tomorrow, but on Thursday.
Yes, so we are no longer sitting tomorrow. I hope that's a message that everyone has received, and for unavoidable reasons. And so we will resume on Thursday at 10 o'clock, when we hear first of all from Mr Johnson KC on behalf of the Scots Government, and then a closing statement by Nicola Leahy, an unrepresented core participant. Can I just invite people to keep an eye on the timetable and any updates, because I've been informed by Mr Johnson in the course of this morning that he does not think he'll be the whole morning. So it may be that we make some adjustments to the timetable, but it may not. If people just keep an eye on the website in that regard. But we should be starting at 10.
We were due to hear tomorrow from Ms Golding KC on behalf of the Lead A clients, Lead A cohort. That is now going to be heard next week.
That's correct.
And the date for that, for those who might be interested?
It's next Tuesday afternoon, and then running on, if necessary, to ensure that she has the full time that was originally scheduled into Wednesday morning.
Very well. So there you if you hadn't picked that up, there you have it. Thank you very much. Until tomorrow, Thursday. There you go. Thursday at 10 o'clock.